Arturo Toscanini was a lonely man who found his fulfillment in music. He received his commission from Verdi himself to perform the works in the spirit of the composer and sacrificed the 100-year-old law of romantic freedom of the performing artist on the altar of objectivism. He shouted at musicians and insulted singers to achieve his goals, always serving a higher cause. He was a dictator of art, but a flawless democrat who defied fascism, which still deserves our unreserved admiration today. Who was Arturo Toscanini and what places and people influenced him? A biographical approach to the artist of the century from Italy. Arturo was born in the Italian city of Parma in 1867. Parma is located in the fertile Po Valley in northern Italy, around 100 kilometers from the metropolis of Milan. His parents were both tailors by trade, and the family lived in modest circumstances. They practiced their profession in their home, in a house that is now a museum dedicated to Toscanini. His father had been drafted into the army 5 years before Arturo was born at the age of 27, but deserted and served in the volunteer army of the freedom fighter Garibaldi and returned decorated with a silver medal. He married Paola and Arturo was born, the first of 4 children. Arturo's mother was a strict and determined woman. His father Claudio was the complete opposite. He was indulgent and seems to have occasionally indulged in pleasures away from his rigorous work as a tailor. Toscanini later recalled that his father was handsome and knew how to take advantage of this. On Sundays he liked to meet up with friends, drink wine and sing opera arias that they knew from the theater. So it was that 7-year-old Arturo discovered the piano when he started school and immediately tried to play his father's songs on the instrument without ever having touched the keys of an instrument. His teacher quickly discovered the boy's interest and talent and personally arranged for his first piano lessons. It is to the parents' credit that they were determined to send the young boy to the conservatory at the age of 9. As all the free boarding school places were already taken, they paid for the expensive fee out of their own pocket in the early days, until the school decided to waive the school fees for the parents due to the boy's talent and eagerness to learn. The conservatory was nothing more and nothing less than a barracks with walls, dormitories and relentless daily schedules. Only on Sundays did the pupils get a bit of a break when relatives were allowed to visit the pupils. Little Arturo's drama was that his parents never visited him. While other pupils received regular visits, Arturo always spent his Sundays alone. Even later, his parents were never to visit him at his concert performances. Strangely enough, his mother's estate contained volumes of newspaper clippings that they had collected over the years. So Arturo was not allowed to enjoy parental affection. He only saw his parents during vacation weeks. Toscanini later said that he could not remember ever having experienced any tenderness from his mother. This raises the question of whether this lack of affection was a reason for the eruptive emotional world that turned the adult Toscanini into an orchestral tyrant whose outburst of anger became legendary. The school subjects at the conservatory did not only include music, but Toscanini received a solid basic education. But music was the main subject. The students were not allowed to choose their instrument subject. Toscanini was assigned the cello. He found solace and happiness in the notes of music, which he immersed himself in with the help of his phenomenal memory. Toscanini never complained. On the contrary, his diligence and conscientiousness were proverbial, and he soon earned himself the half-mocking, half-admiring nickname Little Genius. In addition to the cello, he secretly studied the piano and was only allowed to graduate in this subject because of his immense talent. He secretly formed an orchestra with a handful of friends to play pieces together. Toscanini always knew not only his part by heart, but also that of his fellow players. At the age of 13, he was allowed to take part in the second cellos at the local theatre and became acquainted with the work of an orchestral musician and the repertoire. His most beautiful experience was the performance of the overture to Lohengrin, where the unearthly harmonies are said to have moved him to tears the first time he heard them. His lifelong love of Wagner's music was kindled. In 1884, he graduated from school with the highest marks in his music subjects. With the prize money from his graduation and the money he had painstakingly saved up during his school years, he wanted to live independently from the outset, without becoming a burden on his parents. The following year, Toscanini was engaged for a tour of South America with renowned Italian musicians. He was employed there both as an orchestral musician and a second choral in Conductor. He also accompanied solo singers while rehearsing on the crossing and was therefore proficient in pretty much every piece of music when he arrived in South America, not least thanks to his phenomenal memory. A serious problem then arose at a concert in Rio de Janeiro. A local conductor who was to conduct a performance of Aida was boycotted by the audience. But the two other Italian substitute conductors were also booed by the audience, and the musicians stood around helplessly. Some members of the audience were already beginning to leave the hall when Toscanini boldly took up the baton without a score and quickly opened the opera. The audience was surprised and the opposing members of the audience were hissed. What followed became a legend. The audience became more and more enthusiastic during the opera, and the final curtain became Toscanini's triumph. A conductor was born, and the 19-year-old had to conduct all the remaining 18 performances of the tour, naturally from memory. Of course, attention was also drawn in Italy to the child prodigy who had seemingly come out of nowhere, and Toscanini now accepted engagements as a conductor. The following year, a major event was imminent. Verdi had been working in secret with Arrigo Boito on his Otello and had chosen La Scala in Milan for the premiere. Toscanini applied for the project as an orchestral musician and was engaged as a second cellist. When the old Verdi attended a rehearsal, he noticed the young cellist and actually spoke to him. This encounter increased Toscanini's admiration, and over the next years he repeatedly met the master when he sought his advice during performances of Verdi's operas. And Toscanini was impressed by Verdi's lifelong efforts to combat sloppiness, waywardness, and arbitrariness on the part of the performing musicians. Verdi himself had a reputation as a despotic conductor in his middle years. The orchestral musicians in Paris mockingly called him Merdi behind closed doors. In Verdi, Toscanini now found an artistic role model to whom he could refer. Many doors were now open to Toscanini, and he accepted engagements throughout Italy. Even the established composer Catalani entrusted the soon-to-be 20-year-old with the premiere of one of his works. A closer friendship developed between the two, and Toscanini would later name his first two children after characters from Catalani's opera La Valle. A few years later, Toscanini conducted the world premiere of Pagliacci, which he had led to a surprising and triumphant success. In Palermo, the northern Italian was blackmailed by the mafia, but Toscanini remained steadfast, refusing to hire the mistress of a mafioso, among other things. His toughness and incorruptibility were also felt by the musicians. In Pisa, a dismissed orchestra musician detonated a small bomb to take revenge on Toscanini. Fortunately, there were no casualties. But Toscanini was not only unyielding towards his musicians, but also towards himself. In 1994, for example, he conducted 64 performances in 58 days of 7 different operas in one season in one theatre, not to mention that he was also responsible for the staging. 2 years later, he conducted the world premiere of Puccini's Bohème, but the opera received only a lukewarm reception in Turin. At the age of 30, Toscanini received the honorable commission to conduct 4 symphony concerts at La Scala in Milan. A few months later, the proud Scala was forced to close. Orchestra, singers, dancers, stagehands, and administration, all employees were made redundant. The theatre was left with nothing. A nobleman founded a company and appointed Toscanini and the opera manager Gatti Casazza as musical and commercial director. It became a Herculean task to make a completely new start. Toscanini had to recruit the entire artistic staff anew and at the same time prepare the next opera season. He was now able to set the rules. Blackout during the performance, women were not allowed to wear hats during the performance, and encores were strictly forbidden. For the new opening, he chose Wagner's Meistersinger, which he had never seen before and only had to stage with the help of the score. The first season was a success, and 3 years later La Scala was debt-free. Toscanini had saved La Scala for the first time, and 2 more times were to follow in the course of his life. Verdi died in 1901, and it was Toscanini who conducted the celebrations for his deceased artistic father in various places. A year later, however, the dissonance increased. Once again, the audience demanded an encore. A da capo. Toscanini shook his head again, and the audience attempted a showdown with the maestro. He angrily hurled the broken baton into the audience and left the theatre. Even the lawyer who followed him home was unable to persuade him to return. A short time later, Toscanini left La Scala and returned to work as a freelance conductor. In the meantime, Toscanini had married Carla de Martini, the daughter of a banker, in 1897. Toscanini's parents did not attend the wedding. Carla gave birth to 4 children in the following years. One of them died at an early age. Carla had no personal connection to music, so she never disturbed her husband in his work in the theatre. She seemed to silently accept the fact that Toscanini, just like his father, had his affairs. The most famous of his numerous affairs in the million years was with the celebrated soprano Rosina Storchio. The relationship lasted 7 years, and they had a child together, who died at the age of 16. 3 years later, after his abrupt departure, he returned to La Scala. But it remained an episode, because the Met again knocked at his door. Caruso, who had been at the Met for a few years, had strongly recommended Toscanini. Gatti Casazza was now also approached, and Toscanini was now ready, as he did not want to go to an unknown large house without a manager he didn't know. So in 1908, the 3 companions met again in New York. Gatti Casazza as artistic director, Toscanini as musical director, and Caruso as a celebrated star on stage, whose recording career had already brought him worldwide fame. At the beginning, Toscanini had to share the position of first conductor with Gustav Mahler, who was primarily responsible for the German language repertoire. Gustav Mahler had to leave New York in Toscanini's second season due to serious health problems. So Toscanini became the artistic ruler of the Metropolitan Opera and led the theatre into one of his most glamorous eras with his impressive roster of singers. One of the highlights was the world premiere of Puccini's Fanciulla del West, which took Puccini to New York for an extended period and in which Caruso sang the male lead. After 7 successful years, however, Toscanini surprisingly took his leave of the Met. It is not entirely clear why, whether it was the onset of routine or the constant discussion with the management and board of directors. A personal trigger cannot be ruled out. His 7-year affair with the famous singer Geraldine Farrar had come to a turning point. Farrar gave him an ultimatum. He should leave his wife and children and marry her. A step that was unthinkable for Toscanini. Meanwhile, the World War was raging in Europe. Toscanini's son Walter was called up for military service, and his father hurried to Italy to say goodbye to his son. He not only followed the war with great interest, he was even actively involved as a bandmaster at the front. He is said to have even motivated the troops with music during the fighting. He was awarded the Italian state's Silver Medal for bravery for his efforts. After the end of the war, Toscanini began to give concerts again, sporadically. He insisted on also performing German music, which many concertgoers resented. One journalist by the name of Benito Mussolini in particular reproached him severely. Toscanini then visited Mussolini and the two got to know each other. Toscanini actually wanted to silence the journalist, but Mussolini seems to have impressed the conductor with his then socialist program, and the prominent conductor even had himself put on Mussolini's list in 1920, a step that he was soon to deeply regret. La Scala had also suffered greatly during the war and was at the end of its financial tether. Toscanini was again on hand to lead the theatre out of the crisis. He persuaded the city to grant the opera an autonomous status and to finance it in future by means of an entertainment tax. Once again, the now 53-year-old accepted the hardship of rebuilding the opera. Musicians were now only recruited on the basis of qualifications and auditions. He took the newly formed troupe on an overseas tour to flush money into the empty coffers. In just 10 weeks, the orchestra played an incredible 59 concerts in the USA. The guest appearances at the Met became a triumph and the tour a legend. He also had to prepare the first season. Toscanini opened La Scala with Verdi's Falstaff and personally oversaw 5 of the 12 productions of the season. Now he had reached the goal of his dreams. He was music director, conductor and stage director in one. For 3 years he was free to do whatever he wanted at La Scala. The Tristan and Isolde production, in particular with the controversial yet ingenious stage designer and Wagnerian Appia, became a solitary highlight. Appia was not allowed to work in Bayreuth. His ideas did not suit the traditionalist Cosima Wagner. But he ran into open doors with Toscanini, who wanted to free Wagner from the bearskin stagings. Toscanini thus anticipated Wieland Wagner's productions by 30 years. From 1924 onwards, the fascists tried to exert more and more influence on Italy's cultural flagship. The showdown between Toscanini and the fascist regime came in 1926. When Italy's perhaps greatest cultural event of the 1920s took place, the posthumous premiere of Puccini's Turandot. Toscanini had personally commissioned the posthumous completion of the opera and was the conductor of the premiere. The fascists wanted to hijack the event and once again demanded that the Giovinezza, the fascists' anthem, be played at the beginning of the event. Toscanini again refused. Mussolini intervened personally, raging and threatening Toscanini that he would appear in person. The performance took place without Giovinezza and without Mussolini. A concert in Bologna that never took place became famous. The fascists had set a trap for him. They lured him to Bologna by offering him the opportunity to conduct a concert of music by a contemporary composer whom he held in high esteem. On the morning of the performance, he was presented with a fait accompli and demanded that they play the Giovinezza at the beginning. Toscanini refused, and when he tried to enter the theatre that evening, accompanied by his family, he was harassed and abused by a gang of fascist thugs. Toscanini left the theatre and was subjected to further threats at the hotel. The authorities revoked his passport and his personal safety was no longer guaranteed. There were protests in Milan against the attacks on Toscanini. Thanks to international pressure, the maestro was finally allowed to leave for Switzerland. There, grass could grow over the nasty affair. In 1930, Arturo Toscanini accepted an invitation from Siegfried Wagner, who experienced Toscanini's interpretation of Wagner at La Scala. Now Toscanini was allowed to conduct the music of his second musical idol in Bayreuth. There were quite a few reservations, as Toscanini was the first southern conductor to be allowed to conduct in Bayreuth, but his Tristan and Tannhäuser met with unreserved enthusiasm. The festival took a dramatic turn. Siegfried Wagner died during the rehearsals for Tannhäuser, and his wife Winifred took over the direction of the festival. The following year's festival was Toscanini's last. Although his Parsifal was simply magnificent, Winifred Wagner's closeness to the Nazi regime and her open admiration for Adolf Hitler were unacceptable to the staunch Democrat and avowed anti-fascist. What remained was his friendship for Fridolind Wagner, Siegfried's daughter, who later became a dissident in the Wagner clan. Toscanini's field of activity in Europe became ever narrower. Due to the political situation, Toscanini not only had to give up his work in Bayreuth, but also his position at La Scala. In the 1930s, he divided his working hours. For the winter months, he had himself committed to New York. The summer months belonged to his work at festivals and his beloved stays on a small island in Lago Maggiore, where he enjoyed days with his family and was able to receive many friends. The island became a small anti-fascist refuge where he could meet like-minded people. He chose Salzburg as his new festival venue. In doing so, he deliberately made a political statement in the neutral Austrian town not far from Bayreuth in totalitarian Germany. With Toscanini, the Salzburg festival flourished once again, even though he pushed the artists to their limits. At one point, the musicians sent Toscanini's favorite artist, Lotte Lehmann, to him as an emissary to ask the master for leniency during rehearsals, which only elicited derisive remarks from the 60-year-old. He met Furtwängler in Salzburg in 1937. He informed him that he did not wish to have any contact with him due to his cooperation with the Nazis. Furtwängler then sought out Toscanini, whereupon Toscanini complimented his famous colleague with blunt words from the room. When Hitler succeeded in annexing Austria to the Reich, the Salzburg episode was also over for Toscanini. He then became involved with the festival in Lucerne, Switzerland, one of the last European countries not to be under totalitarian rule. Lucerne had a special appeal for Toscanini as Wagner had lived in Triebschen in Lucerne for many years. As an emotional highlight of the Lucerne days, Toscanini gave a private performance of Siegfried Idyll with a dozen musicians in the stairwell of the Villa Wagner, just as Richard Wagner had done 60 years earlier in Cosima's honor. This marked the end of Toscanini's work on the old continent. Toscanini had already begun to put down roots in the USA in 1929 by accepting a long-term engagement with the New York Philharmonic. Now Toscanini moved to the USA for good. His whole family came with him and they lived in a beautiful house in Riverdale on the Hudson River. His daughter Wanda had married the already famous pianist Vladimir Horowitz in the USA, and they gave him their granddaughter Sonia, whom Toscanini enjoyed very much. With Horowitz, Toscanini recorded one of his best-selling and best-loved records, Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto. Toscanini's personality as a conductor was unique, and his outbursts of anger during rehearsals are legendary. Many of them have been recorded.
You are always late! Porco di un Dio santissimo! Oh, you are dead! È una vergogna! Shame on you!
The musicians dreaded every rehearsal with the maestro. Toscanini knew every single note of every work he conducted. Not a single wrong note or incorrect phrasing escaped his notice. If a musician or the orchestra was not up to scratch, he could be merciless and unworthy to the musicians. It was sheer terror. Many musicians have testified to this in interviews. But they also testify to their admiration for the fact that no other conductor allowed them to surpass themselves as they did with Toscanini. His fire for music was honest and his ear incorruptible. For Toscanini, fidelity to the work and the score was at the beginning of every interpretation. Toscanini was the representative of objectivity. He paid the most attention to tempo. For him, it was the basis for every interpretation. The tradition of the 19th century Italian opera was the pure opposite. The tempo was created in the performance and the rubato became the singer's trademark. Toscanini's most significant historical achievement was to have taken the rubato and the sovereignty over tempo away from the singers. The 100-year primacy of the singer was broken by Toscanini. The charm of Toscanini's performance art was the perfection and the fervor of the striving for this perfection. Of course, Toscanini's art was also criticized. Toscanini had consigned romantic freedom, let's call it subjectivity, to the dustbin of history. This raised important questions. Weren't the ornaments, rubati and tempo variations of the music missing? Hadn't Beethoven and Wagner also demonstrably interpreted their own music very freely? Is it permissible to play the Verdi of the highly romantic Trovatore in the same way as the music drama of Otello? The German Wilhelm Furtwängler was regarded as the representative of this subjectivity and thus as Toscanini's antipode. The rivalry between these two conductors was the conflict of two worldviews, two temperaments, and two views of music and morality in the 20th century. At the end of the 1930s, the NBC approached Toscanini with a proposal to found an orchestra that would be built especially for Toscanini with the best orchestral musicians. Toscanini agreed, and it became his artistic home for the next 17 years. With the live recordings from Rockefeller Center, Toscanini reached an audience of millions and became a household brand in the United States. Thus, Toscanini's recordings legacy consists in large part of this period, of a studio that had very dry acoustics. Toscanini became involved during the war, playing many concerts with the orchestra to promote war bonds, for which the American president Roosevelt thanked him personally several times. At the end of World War II, La Scala was no longer just in ruins financially. Once again, the 8-year-old Toscanini mustered his strength and helped La Scala back on its feet. The theatre was the first public building in Italy to be restored. The reopening took place with a concert conducted by Toscanini. Toscanini gave his last concert with the NBC Symphony in 1954 at Carnegie Hall. During the concert, the 87-year-old experienced a blackout. He stopped conducting for a minute and held a hand over his eyes. He conducted the concert to an end, but he never stepped onto the podium again. 3 years later, the 90-year-old collapsed in his home in Riverdale, died 2 weeks later, and his body was brought to Italy, where he was buried in Milan's monumental cemetery.